The thing that is most important to say about YouTube psychology or online psychology, especially when it comes to a lot of the people, so-called experts, who talk about narcissism and narcissistic abuse. They are very right in the horrible effects and the trauma that comes from narcissistic abuse. They are very right about that. This is a pandemic in society. First of all, narcissism is a pandemic in society which hurts other people in a way that nearly becomes a pandemic in society also. This is because people suffer from PTSD and complex PTSD. Narcissism is sometimes, not always of course, but sometimes a reaction that is a PTSD reaction because it's a trauma reaction. It's a response to trauma. It's a response to hidden wounds in the psyche. So everything's fine about... the thing that we really truly need knowledge about is narcissism and toxic people and dangerous people and psychopaths and how we can get hurt and how we also hurt other people. This is what we need knowledge of. But what these so-called experts on YouTube and online experts don't see, don't understand, is that personality traits and personality disorders are constituted at least to a 50% degree by brain programs. They are habitual patterns in the brain that have been formed, and formed exactly because of trauma, because of wounds, because of experience. It's a survival strategy. So narcissism is sometimes a survival strategy for a very hurt person, for a very wounded person. Even psychopathy, a psychopath, is sometimes simply a person who is in survival mode, who lives in psychopathy as a personality disorder trait, simply because he needs that as his brain has developed that for him. His brain has developed that as a survival strategy. It has nothing to do really with the personality, because the personality is hidden. The personality is the ice under the water, like in the iceberg, you see only the tip of the iceberg. You see the programs, you see the psychopathy, you see the narcissist on top of the water, but you don't see what's under the water. And that which is under the water is that in the psychopath, in the narcissist, that he or she doesn't have access to, because they cannot see it, because they are stuck in their own brain programs. I've also made a video about this called Narcissism Explained. A very short but concise explanation of this. And I believe that to be very true. That which is a personality trait is simply sometimes not a personality trait, but a developed neurocircuitry program in the brain that developed as a survival strategy, or as a coping mechanism, or as a protective measure. And these things are that which we see as personality traits and personality disorders. But they're not that, because the personality is that which is under the water. That which the person who is sick cannot see, because he cannot have access to that, because his brain is stuck in the programs that is producing narcissism and survival strategies and coping mechanisms. So this is very important to understand. There are some online that are good. Sam Vaknin is very clever, truly intelligent. He's a hyper-sane person, I would say, and that's maybe why he was diagnosed with narcissism personality disorder twice in his life. And as I have heard, also scored clearly on psychopathy. But this may also be because he is hypersane, because he's really clever. And sometimes clever people get diagnosed with psychiatric disorders by incompetent doctors, by incompetent and less clever, less intelligent psychiatrists. Sometimes they stick diagnoses onto a genius, onto a person who is truly clever. Sometimes the person is, of course, maybe a wounded, damaged soul and a narcissist and a psychopath. Other times he's simply just a very clever person who don't tolerate the bullshit that incompetent people and that incompetent doctors present. And that's why the doctor called them a narcissist and a psychopath. Well, Mr. Wolther, you don't accept anything that I say, so you are clearly a psychiatric case. You have a pathology here. Yes, doctor, I know. The reason why I don't accept anything that you say is because you're an incompetent fool. You believe that which is false, and you only believe the lies that you are producing in your own little housewife brain. You know, you're a stupid man, little doctor. Why don't you go home and empty your little pampers and grow up? Educate yourself for a change. Oh, Mr. Wolther, if you talk like that, that means that you're a narcissist or probably a psychopath. I will write down as a diagnosis for you that you are a psychopath or a narcissist. You know, it was just an example, but something like that. Can go something like that. You know, I've said that before. This world is a war among idiots. You know, this world is a war among idiots. It's a war among men who have not educated themselves. It's a war among imbeciles. It's a stupid, idiot world because of people who have not educated themselves. And Sam Vaknin is educated and very clever, but in my mind he's stuck in the 1970s. He's stuck with his nose in the DSM manual, and everyone who is stuck in the DSM manual is hopelessly stuck in the paradigm of the 1970s, because the 1970s is the era of the DSM manual. And if you believe the DSM manual, if you take the DSM manual as truth, then you are stuck in the 1970s and you have not educated yourself about neuroscience. The DSM manual is a very helpful tool for diagnostic criteria to see and expose pathologies, of course, to understand pathologies of the human psyche and of our psychology. But to believe the diagnoses as fixed, rigid diagnostic models that personalities or people fit into is simply inhumane, stupid, incompetent, childish, and hopelessly lost and outdated as a view. So anyone who believes in the validity of the DSM manual in that way, in that fashion, is a hopelessly outdated person who could never be an expert in anything, because he's simply not understood the human program. He hasn't understood the brain. He hasn't understood anything. So before you understand the human program, before you understand the brain, I would say until you understand the human program and until you understand the brain, you shouldn't put your nose too deeply into the DSM manual. Because if you put your nose too deeply into the DSM manual and put your little doggy or cat eyes onto the text of the DSM manual, you will be hopelessly deluded and silly and stupid, and you will be completely outdated as a person of knowledge, especially when it comes to psychology and the human psyche. So be careful about that. Until you understand the brain, until you understand neurocircuitry, until you understand the human program in its totality, actually, you should not put your nose too deeply into the DSM manual, because the DSM manual is based on a paradigm that is outdated. It's simply like that. It is outdated. And anything that is in the DSM manual is also something that springs out of neurocircuitry. A neurocircuitry that in itself springs out and develops from trauma, from survival strategies, from coping mechanisms. And you cannot really call that personality traits. You cannot call that personality traits. You know, okay, you can call it personality disorder because you have a disorder, you have a neurosis in the brain, you have something that makes you stray from the normal, natural personality that you are. But that is not because of a disorder in the personality. It's a because of habitual patterns in the brain. It's because of neurocircuitry. So the neurocircuitry is creating that which we see as personality traits. The neurocircuitry, the brain programs that we develop by habits after experience, and especially after traumatic experience, as coping mechanisms and as survival strategies, and as strategies for survival and for strategies for the presentation of the self, as a strategy for the constitution and the creation of the self and the maintenance of the self, and of course for the presentation of the self in social situations and stuff like that. So I mean, this is a huge canvas to open and to see, and in order to see that canvas, we just have to take a look inside the brain and not put our noses too deeply into the DSM manual, really. They reflect pathologies, and pathologies are something that are very fluid and change daily, and everything can change quite rapidly when it comes to this, when it comes to therapy, when it comes to enlightenment, when it comes to knowledge, self-insight, when it comes to alterations of brain states, you know, and you can alter and modify brain states with many different techniques, you know, and narcissism and mental disorders and mental sickness and disease is actually a brain state in some sense. It's produced by the brain because the brain is dysregulated. It's a dysregulated nervous system that is causing the mental disease. It's a dysregulated nervous system that is causing this disease. And if that dysregulation is purely mental, emotional, stems from trauma or neurosis, in that case we could say that it is psychological, has psychological foundations, then yes, of course, it can be treated. If it is organic, if it is biological, if it comes from a brain damage, of course, then it's much more difficult to do, and one has to modify it with medicine or other things. But anyway, this was just a little comment, because it's great to see people who are clever and intelligent and smart, but it's also important to let people know that these people who are clever and intelligent and smart, sometimes they are really stupid, sometimes they are really blind, sometimes they are fools and amateurs, even though they want to be a professional. That's the paradox of education, you know. The paradox of the enlightened person is that he's both the most professional person you can imagine, and he's also a complete fool. You know, that's both sides of the coin when it comes to knowledge. So please take everything with a pinch of salt. Everything that I say, of course, that goes without saying, and everything that other people say as well, because paradigms and knowledge and theory changes fast, just as we change our clothes. Okay, thank you.